My name is Ruthie Doyle. I work for New Frontier at Sundance. It's a dynamic initiative that identifies, fosters, and exhibits artists who are innovating on the art and form of story. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the Making a New Reality research that Kamal Sinclair, my colleague, has been conducting, which asks the main question: how do we further equality in and through emerging media? Something that we haven't achieved in 500 years of mass media. This is research done by Kamal Sinclair, commissioned by the JustFilms initiative of the Ford Foundation with support from Sundance. Our publication partner is Immersive. The methodology was that Kamal completed over 100 in-depth 1 to 2 hour qualitative interviews and a review of scholarly and trade literature. And there were 3 big questions that they identified to ask. And I should say these are big questions. We're definitely still in it. As we all know, emerging media, we've heard all day long, it's still like this messy, evolving thing. But we're also literally still in the research. So there's a lot of information. I'm going to move fast. I don't expect to catch it all. But I do hope to kind of give you a survey of what we've been working on, both as part of our work and at New Frontier, and including the research that we've been doing, that Kamal's been doing. So those 3 questions are: what is emerging media? Small question. What concerns do you have related to equality in emerging media? And how do we mitigate those concerns? So we'll start with, what's emerging media? Well, we've been kind of talking about it all day, right? And some of you are complete experts, probably know more than I do. And some of you maybe are newer to emerging media, maybe. But I do think it's important that I kind of do a quick survey of some of the things that we're talking about, so we all kind of are on the same foundation of what it means to be designing for our future, because some of these technologies are so powerful, some of these technologies that are coming down the pipeline. And by definition, these are all things that are emerging, so they're becoming known, they're being invented, they're in the process of innovation right now. We heard this morning, we had a great introduction to story from William. Story doesn't exist until it's been experienced. And the way that we share story is through our communication architecture, so oral storytelling, cave paintings, text, still images, moving image, and we're moving into emerging media. But story is our oldest software. The way that we share information, the way that we share who we are, the way that we talk about our identities as communities. And if story is our oldest software, then our body is our oldest hardware. We've definitely got the most sophisticated sensors, way more sophisticated than any we've ever made. Your skin alone is an incredible amount of information that you're able to take in. And as the communication architecture is continuing to grow more complex and more quickly, we're moving from those still images, moving from the text in the printing press that we heard this morning, to still images, to moving image, now to these embodied, immersive ways of sharing information. And at New Frontier, our work has been thinking about what are the ways that that communication architecture is changing? What are ways that storytellers are experimenting with that? And what will that look like in the next 20 years? We're interested in how artists are leveraging and catalyzing these changes. So we're not futurists. We don't claim to know everything. We're following where the artists are experimenting, where we as artists are experimenting. And there's certainly always room to do better through iteration. We're constantly listening with curiosity, learning and being proven wrong in all different kinds of ways. But there's one thing that's really clear, is there's a really clear connection between imagination, innovation, and manifestation, and in terms of technology, but also in terms of the social structures and the way that that communication architecture changes who we are as a society. Surely people have seen Minority Report at this point. Minority Report's story world was created by the production designer, Alex McDowell, as well as, well, a bunch of people, but Dr. John Underkoffler as part of his research at MIT. And they actually created this whole system of interface, which actually became a real technology. Gestural interface as a way of editing, as a way of sharing stories. It's still a company that exists today. So we see directly imagination to innovation to affecting our existing reality, which then these kinds of gestural interfaces become a tool for people like Chris Melk to create these physically responsive poems like The Treasure of Sanctuary. So our artists are actually the technologists and the scientists themselves. This is a story that is told with the screen as a building. So it's the first short story told on a building. The tools to make this piece did not exist and what the artist needed didn't exist, so he invented them himself. So he now holds 10 patents in projection mapping. So we'll talk about a little bit more about what the artists are exploring in addition to being these innovators and technologists and scientists. Lynette Woolworth, who Stu just mentioned from Australia, how does the body, how does touch, how does tactile media affect emerging media? You know, we want to touch things. We have to put signs on things that say do not touch, right? And what does that mean in a digital context? So this was one early experimentation by Lynette Woolworth, where you actually went up and put your hand up to the hand of another person on the screen. In this case, it was women who had survived major incidences of genocide. And it was really moving for people to have that kind of digital experience as she emerged towards you to the screen. Immersive live experiences, so people who are mixing their physical body, mixing performance with a mixed digital and real space. In this case, Dandy Punk, who actually, these are his drawings that he makes into projection mapping. So the next level of projection mapping in a very contained and mapped out space. And then, of course, we heard from William earlier today, too, interactive media. So be that interactive books, interactive films, social media, and in this case, interactive games. The artists, in many cases, were actually creating the best practices for user interface and also showing that there was still a role of the artist. The role of the artist was not dead, as many people had suggested with the rise of user-generated content. So the artists may not be able to control the experience, but they are crucial in setting up what that story world is, what those constraints are in terms of how the audience co-creates or can play within that story world. So this is an example of Dhaka Gaming, 1979 Revolution. Naveed Kansari came from a background of AAA games. So he created the cinematic look, talk about innovation, created the cinematic look of games like Max Payne and Grand Theft Auto. He paired up with his partner, who's a documentary filmmaker, to make this piece, which is about his experience as a child in the 1979 revolution in Iran. So every choice, every piece of the branching narrative is based in historical truth. And it really allows for this kind of interaction, allows for people to have more subtle interactions, to see gray areas and vulnerabilities, to really experience what a complicated situation like revolution might feel and look like. Of course, we have augmented reality, so it's still kind of using screens, but using the whole world as a canvas with new layers of information. And then moving beyond screens to think about geo-aware or geolocative experiences, in this case, ambient data storytelling, or Internet of Things, having kind of an ambient interface. It's a way to express data in ways that are more integrated, or aesthetically pleasing, or more related directly to our body. So in this case, this is a speculative artifact from the Ayapo repository. It's an Afrofuturist artifact. It's a lantern, so when you carry it around, it actually lights up in the places where a black man has been killed by police violence. And then we have people who are like, okay, well, that's all well and good. We've worked with screens, we've worked with weird screens, we've mixed them, and we've moved past screens. But we're sort of missing something. We're still sort of missing the experience. We're sort of missing the experience of the senses. So people started doing sensory experiments, in this case, using smell. So hacking our old school haptics, our old school sensors, right? The original hardware. And, this piece, you went into this, can't think of the word, isolation chamber, and it was told through sound and smell, and it was famous deaths like JFK or Whitney Houston and what that might have sounded and smelled like. And past story rituals, and still our rituals do, include definitely smell as a strong component if it's incense or food or even sweat, smoke. So bringing that sensory experience back into our storytelling. And then, again, kind of moving back to screens, but immersive screens with virtual reality, but really simple hacking into our bodies' haptics. Has anybody tried Birdly? Okay, so a couple of people actually. So you're actually put in this hydraulic machine, kind of in the position you would expect to be flying, like Superman in the old days or something. And then you've got virtual reality on your face, and this is just really simple. It's a fan blowing at you. So it really is pretty compelling in terms of replicating the experience of flying. And you've got the point of view of a hawk inside of the screen. And then this was a piece that we had at the festival a couple of years ago, talking really specifically about innovation, imagination, and manifestation, but really about hacking the brain. So scientists were able to, through a combination of physical therapy and virtual reality, to help paraplegics to move again. So not necessarily to walk on their own. I don't think that's realistic to expect maybe ever, but also with the current state of technology. But they were able to allow some movement using virtual reality and physical therapy. And something that was really important is that many people were allowed to do some of their toileting on their own, which is just a basic quality of human existence that was drastically improved through virtual reality. So that's pretty major when you're hacking your brain on that level in a way that we haven't been able to figure out how to do in any other way up until now. Other ways we're extending the physical capabilities of the human body. In this case, real-time cinematography, real-time processing. This is Bjork giving an interview in her avatar. So when a person is only able to be virtually present in the same time as their conversational partner, so they're not able to be physically present. We've had a lot of advancements in image capture, or maybe people are able to be present at the same time and place, but they want to be somewhere else. So in this case, you're able to be in a virtual space together, so we've got social VR. Or as our image capture has gotten better and better with photogrammetry, light field coming, volumetric capture, maybe the person can't be present in the same time or the same space, or maybe the person's no longer with us and we still want to be able to communicate with them. So being able to communicate with someone virtually. In this case, New Dimensions Testimony from the USC Shoah Foundation, they've actually now done this with, I think, 15 Holocaust survivors and one other person I'm forgetting in the moment. But it uses natural language processing, cognitive computing, and these new capture technologies so that you're able to have a conversation. It's pretty incredible. It really felt like a fluid and compelling conversation. Some people were asking factual questions. Where are you from? Did you have brothers or sisters? And I thought, well, I'm going to ask a hard question. So I said, what do you suggest for young people today? And it was a bit of a meandering answer, but it definitely got there in a way that was really moving. I mean, I was totally sold at that point. And, an answer from a 90-year-old man is probably going to be meandering on that topic anyway. But really, really incredible and powerful, bringing together all of these technologies in terms of extending the capabilities of being present with another human being and sharing that knowledge, which certainly has the capability to shape our society and identity. Robots also. We see the fast coming social AI, artificial intelligence of evolving intellect. So in this case, Stephanie Dinkins, who is an artist and technologist, started having conversations with Bina 48 that are sometimes awkward and hilarious, but also really moving and poignant. And she's been able to actually influence that and now has a project about her own family centering the relational databases. So now it's possible to actually, through interviews, upload the experience of a human being that then that AI of evolving intellect is able to learn and grow through its interactions over time. So it's based on an existing data set of a human being, but continues to become intelligent. And so centering it on, in this case, a Black woman that was the person who generated this project. It's their wife. But in Stephanie's case, with her new project, centering it on Black women who also are her family. So it's extremely localized and personal, at the same time as being very important in terms of the larger landscape of where algorithms are usually centered. And people who are hacking directly into that original hardware, the body directly with a cyborg-like integration of technology, really making that physiological commitment to being paired with technology. I accidentally brought my phone up to give a presentation, right? This feels like an extension of my hand. So we're already cyborgs in a certain way. Many people say we're already post-biological. But this is kind of taking it to the next step in terms of this is not only assistive, because there's been a lot of innovation that's been through the medical field, but this is assistive as well as artistic. So he's able to hear color. He's colorblind. So he talks about different places have a different soundscape based on the kinds of colors that are there. The grocery store, for example. And this isn't, assistive in the sense that it's an absolute necessity, which is interesting. There are also implants that are purely based on convenience. Maybe you want an implant that opens your front door, or businesses are also implementing those kinds of things. And Steve Jobs is really convinced that the biggest innovations of the 21st century would be in the relation to biology and technology, biotech. This is a piece called Stranger Visions from one of our fellows, Heather Dewey-Hagborg. She actually collected bits of human detritus from the streets of New York, so a piece of gum, cigarette butts, and was able to extract, just from those things she's found on the ground, extract bits of DNA and then make portraits of who those people were based on their DNA. Yeah, and she used herself as a control and kind of let herself make decisions that were maybe not exactly faithful to who she was, and it was still a very faithful portrait to who she was. So I have to tell you, I was definitely thinking about spitting out my gum in the subway after that. So obvious ways that this could advance social infrastructure in lots of different ways. This is another piece that she's recently finishing called T3511, where she actually, with her EDU address as a researcher, got a sample of saliva for research and sent it through, I believe it was 23andMe, and then through Ancestry, social media, actually was able to identify who that person was. In a way that she totally expected would not work and would not be that easy. So, I'm definitely going to go to the doctor's office and they're like, oh, we'll just do a genetic something or other. I'm like, I don't know about that. Everybody thinks you have a tinfoil hat, but I don't want my name connected to all my genetic information. It's not that hard to do. And then this is really incredible, that scientists have been able to encode information into bacteria. So this is, famous for frames of film. But the original GIF you see on the top, and you can see what they were able to recall off of the bacteria. So it's still pretty faithful. So maybe that's our new sustainable way of storage, because we've got this very unsustainable server-based system. Maybe we're going to be growing bacteria in the future, which could help our biome in lots of other ways. So a lot to imagine there. And I don't mean to say that we're not going to continue to have books. I don't think we're going to stop having traditional media. People thought that the phone would ruin things, and then people, every step of the way we think, oh, well, it's going to ruin everything else. I think they're going to continue to coexist in a landscape of media. But you can see that it's rapidly changing and becoming a very powerful landscape of technology, gesture-based interfaces, immersive screens, moving past screens, and ways of expanding our senses and capabilities past our human body via real-time technology. So, what could possibly be the concerns after explaining all of that? And this is something that was asked of every interviewee. And I'm going to start talking first in the context of our own work at New Frontier, which is integrated into the research, actually. But then I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the specific bullet points after that. But one of the interviewees, and I'll just read the quote because I know it's distracting to have text on the screen anyway. The progress of racial justice and the development of technologies are not linear. Every time you develop a new technology, you need to have a thought process about the history and system of oppression that the technology is being created and released into. So we're talking about bending that moral arc of justice, but in tech specifically. Because the stakes are too high, you can just imagine from just the short trajectory I took us on together. And the context is so urgent now because of this rapid, larger paradigm shift in innovation. And the World Economic Forum actually calls this the fourth industrial revolution, which some people take issue with, and that's fine. I won't discuss that today, but it does show the way that some people are thinking about it, and it's massive. So there's enormous promise for civilization, but it could also pose some really powerful threats if we don't start thinking about that now in the designing and imagination of our future, and creating an equitable and livable space. So at New Frontier, we actually have been, and many of you too, have been really, it's really an interesting time because we saw the birth of a medium through virtual reality. This is Nalini Del Pena's piece, Hunger in Los Angeles, which was an early second wave of VR experiment. They were working out of a USC lab in California, and they had a really expensive headset. It was like a really complicated setup. It required the whole room. I mean, they could not leave that building. They were absolutely forbidden from taking that very expensive, very complicated equipment anywhere. But they really wanted to show this piece at Sundance, so they created their own mobile prototype. And Palmer Luckey, who many of you will recognize the name, was actually the intern that drove the gear out, working with Nani on that project. It was really complicated. It was one piece that was really hard to set up. It took a long time, but it was the start of something really incredible because, as many of you know, then Palmer Luckey went on to crowdfund iteration of the Oculus Rift, and in 2014, shortly after the 2014 festival, which then we had multiple headsets of that actual prototype, the DK1, Oculus was bought by Facebook for $2 billion. So we started to see these old patterns of power play out. In the beginning, there's a lot of DIY, there's a lot of different kinds of people, there's a lot of diversity of thought, there's a lot of people who are playing. And over time, and Gob spoke a little bit about this in kind of a different, from a different direction, but it became more homogenized, and the money was going to some of the same old familiar places of power, men, white people, et cetera. And in 2014, was the first Oculus Connect conference in October, so they were bought earlier in the year. And about 1,000 developers were handpicked from 150,000 developers worldwide. And that conference was staggeringly homogenous, as you might imagine. And when a woman in the audience who was herself a VR creator said, hey, I kind of noticed that everybody sort of looks the same for the most part. There's a really short line in the women's bathroom. She was kind of basically mocked from the stage, and they gave her the meritocracy argument. Well, this is meritocracy, and we hire the best, and these are the people who are the best at what we're doing. And she was hazed and received threats online for weeks after that, just for asking the question. So, the work that we do, we have intersectional friendships, we have intersectional colleagues, people of different kinds that are around us, so it feels really intuitive. We know there are people making, but that wasn't the case in this particular moment. Then also in 2014, we had a residency at the MIT Media Lab with Sepp Kamvar and his social computing group. It was a database storytelling residency for artists who weren't already technologists. And Sepp was very clear at that point that code is the new superpower, that it designs our social processes, and those social processes design the world around us. So, food trucks couldn't exist in the way that they exist in the US without Twitter. We have the capability to see more and more green space because of Uber. Waze has changed the way that we approach our city. He actually talks about they created their child's preschool using algorithms, which is really fascinating and really strongly recommend you check it out. And then Robert Wong at the Google Creative Lab was interviewed and really talked about his concern about the marginalization of people from the arts and humanities in the tech sector. We also talked to a major tech company CEO who talked about his vision for the future, which seemed kind of soulless, and then of course turns out was only engineered by engineers. And when asked, well, do you have any artists who are thinking about this tech and human future with you? He's like, oh no, well, maybe we should do that. So there were lots of people who also raised concerns on the opposite, that there was a marginalization of tech folks in the arts and humanities. So does anybody happen to know why the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded? There was some sealant. There was some O-rings. Some panels melted. High temperatures. We had some really complicated hardware issues, it sounds like, right? So NASA did a study, and what do you think that they came up with? A lack of diversity of thought. Groupthink. So the reason that they came up with that the space shuttle exploded was because they didn't see their blind spots, or the people who did see the blind spots didn't feel like they were able to speak up. So we cannot continue to navigate these major disruptions that are coming, that are changing the way that our world works, without really taking this into account. We don't want to be steering humanity in the wrong direction. We're smarter than that. You know, this test was used actually in Brown v. Education, Supreme Court decision in the United States about segregation of schools to legally demonstrate that there's demonstrable harm. So what's happening here is they asked preschool-age children, all different races, white and black, which one of the dolls is better. Or I think they asked which one's good. And over and over again, they were choosing the white doll. And they would say they were prettier, they seemed smarter. I mean, the dolls are exactly the same, but one's a white doll and one's a black doll. And so this is literally, it's not because there was a preschool lesson where the teacher sat them all down and said, well, just so you know, the white babies are good. And no, absolutely not. It's about the way that people are taking in information around them all the time, the messages that they're receiving. So again, legally demonstrable harm, scientifically demonstrable harm. You know, when people are able to talk about their illness in a different way, they're actually able to have physically better health outcomes. So it really encodes in us. Story is encoding our operating system, the way that we think about ourselves. That's why it's so dangerous to have blind spots in media. Very important that we have a diverse group of voices, co-creating, designing story experiences. You know, again, since the dawn of media, I'm seeing that I'm running out of time, so I'm going even faster, so sorry about that. But since the dawn of time, very few people have controlled the landscape for media since the dawn of mass media. So that's more than, I keep saying 500 years, more than 500 years, almost 600 years. And still the majority of global media is generated and distributed on platforms that are controlled by a very small number of people. It's been a 400-year run of genocide and slavery. This is in the US, but you know, can definitely have other contexts. That built the foundation for industrialization. Industrialization moving through all the natural resources, coal, uranium, oil, and moving us into a multinational corporate exploit, and we just got the bill, which is climate change. So, you know, what did it mean that just before the turn of the 20th century, some of our best story coders, we were committing genocide against? And maybe they had the key to the firewall that could be protecting us from this disaster that we're now paying the bill for. And if this is the next industrial revolution, as according to the World Economic Forum, it's beyond a moral imperative. It's about a larger human well-being. It's about outcomes and non-profit-based products. It's about us as people. So this is an interesting time to also mention that at a certain point, people are like, okay, I get it, this is really terrible. I'm a white person, what can I do? How do white people need to sacrifice, right? And it's not about sacrificing. It's about people already in the dominant position, not benefiting from all of those voices and experiences that exist outside of that dominant narrative. Where somebody also asked me, well, I'm a straight white male, so I was like, I could never make my work. Does it mean I can't tell my stories? Does it mean Sundance will never support me? And so that's kind of this capitalist-based scarcity as well. So we've gone from 600 years of the scale being tipped this way to, oh, we'll just tip the scale in the opposite direction. And that's not the concept. It's about building a bigger pie, not making ever smaller pieces of the pie. So it's about rethinking what's important and what kind of voices could really be adding to our experience. And we talked about Jeremy Bailenson earlier today, who says VR is like uranium. And we had a very small, we're in another moment of really defining what emerging media means and looks like. So, we had a very small number of people who were determining what the power and best use of uranium was, which they decided was a weapon. And Stu just so wonderfully talked about Lynette Woolworth's collision, so I won't go deep into it, but it could be all the way from, automatic faucets that are calibrated to white skin, so they don't work with dark skin, or to assumptions about who will commit crimes, whether the algorithms are inherently biased. Stu talked about collisions in Uranium, Morgan, and how they've actually affected policy in many ways. And now Awavana, Lynette's next piece, is talking not only about those cultural collisions, but also about the awareness, about this vast richness of human experience and knowledge that we're not even including in the narratives about our society. So we've learned from history, industrial revolutions have brought great value, but at great cost, especially to justice, equality, and greater well-being. that stories and images have impact, they make meaning, they actually affect the way that we experience ourselves and each other, and that it's impossible to understand in advance the consequences of these kinds of massive changes. So I'm going to just quickly go through just a quick survey of some of these major concerns. You can, we've already talked about a lot of them as we went along in talking about the work of New Frontier, but you can find out more at makinganewreality.org. That's the name of this research. There's tons of extensive information that you can continue to dive deeper because I cannot in any way touch on all of them. Biased narratives, so we already kind of talked about that. Our brain quickly makes assumptions about a whole group of people. The innovator stereotype, you see, you think about the cisgendered, able-bodied white man and his counterpart, the cisgendered, able-bodied Asian man, being the innovator. And as you see, women have continued to reach parity in other kinds of professions, but in 1985, not in computer science. That was just the time that the computer came out as a home toy for boys and was aggressively marketed in that way. So girls started out behind boys who then were women who were behind men in computer science and were, hazed out of the profession. If it's happening in 2014, it was certainly happening in 1985. Won't go too much into this. I think this is one that's been particularly well advertised. Diversity and representation gaps. Meritocracy and pipeline arguments. This is a really interesting one because it's a continued repeated reason why media, film, games, et cetera, emerging media, don't have more representation. It doesn't necessarily stand up that, well, it's the best people and the best people aren't women, well, in part because of what we just talked about. But they're not thinking about implicit bias. So Maureen Fan, for example, the CEO of Baobab Studios, talks about she has two pitches, and one has a male voiceover and one has a female voiceover. And they're exactly the same pitch, but they get 40% more money when they use a male voiceover. Right? Or the symphony wanted to increase their diversity, so they thought, okay, well, surely there's good women. We know there are women who can play. Well, we'll just put up a curtain. So they put up a curtain. You couldn't see the person. Didn't solve the problem. And they were like, well, what could it possibly be? Does anybody have any ideas how else you might know that a woman is coming on a stage besides seeing her? Yeah. Heels. So she's coming out and she's clicking along. Okay, well, it's still obviously a woman. So they put a carpet down on the floor. They put a curtain up. Lo and behold, they had parity in the symphony. Simple as a carpet and a curtain, right? Patronizing attitudes, which was also something when people are mocked. I'm going to read this directly so I don't mess this up, but in a 2014 Silicon Valley conference, important year 2014, Palmer Luckey says, everyone wants to have a happy life, but it's going to be impossible to give everyone everything they want. VR, he said, gives less privileged people, like Chinese workers or people who are living in Africa, the chance to escape the real world and experience life as good as we do here in California. So that's what I call let them eat VR. Yeah, and that's also, again, that scarcity mentality. This also brings up the controversial idea of the empathy machine that many people have heard of VR, and a lot of people are really bristling up against that, thinking that it's privileged people kind of going on a safari at its worst. And at its best, people like Firelight Media are calling for a solidarity, not empathy. We don't want your empathy. We want you to be an ally. Silos of knowledge and discipline, William talked about this a lot. It's not only a lack of shared knowledge, but a lack of respect for each other's fields, artists and engineers, for example. Biased algorithms and filter bubbles, we talked about this morning too. I'm moving quickly. But I'll give you a quick example. Google's online advertising system showed an ad for high-income jobs to men much more often than it showed it to women. And when you search for CEO, it produced 11% women in Google image searches, even though 27% of US CEOs are women. So, consolidated media landscape, we've already talked about this, so I'm moving fast. But again, they're using this to their own gain. And you can't say that independent media is truly democratized either. We have financial and resource barriers to entry, as we all know. And with easy self-publishing and with cheap tools, we then have a ton of noise. So we're kind of missing out on what some of those incredible content breakthroughs are because we have a saturation of content. Cybersecurity, privacy, and regulation. A lot of vulnerabilities and unknown things we don't even know about. Corporations are in our homes now with AI smart devices collecting data to do what? But do we want to have early regulation that's going to then kill innovation? Ethical boundaries. This was a very complicated piece that was at the Whitney Biennial. It's not a Sundance piece. But we're in serious need of some ethical standards, but it's also, studies have shown that experiencing abuse and harassment in VR can have the same PTSD effects of experiencing abuse and harassment in the real world. So again, hacking that brain power. Lack of safe spaces. Obviously, as the example in the developers conference, I think it's pretty well advertised that it's really untenable environments for women, people of color, queer people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, especially in gaming. There's a culture of trolling and cyberbullying. But a space can also feel unsafe when a person of color comes into a white space where, again, they feel like they're being othered or exoticized. This was a piece that we showed at the festival that some people kind of gave that feedback about. They felt very protective of their community in this privileged white space. Appropriation and co-opting, it kind of speaks for itself, but it also, using women and minority talent or other kinds of marginalized voices, using that talent without properly crediting or compensating them. Diversity stigma, sometimes calling a diversity program can feel like labeling, like charity, rather than feeling like it's an inclusive space of people who are talented individuals. It can also kind of erase the fluidity of identity, which is, it's kind of an old model to think of there being these very fixed categories. Navigating disruption, this is a big one. What are we going to do when everything changes? Things are already changing. And thinking about AI in particular, is the surplus that is going to be created because of breakthroughs in AI going to only the few? So what does it mean to have sustainable and equitable surplus? We haven't done very well with that so far, especially not in the United States. And how can everyone thrive and benefit? Achievement gap, so it is not only implicit bias in hiring, I'm not mean to say that, there is also a biased education system that limits the pipelines. So right now, we're having a crisis, especially in the United States, we're in a very specific moment, but in imagining our future. So not only imagining our futures as individuals with these coming innovations, but also, sorry, I'm tangled and hot. Also as a community. So, this seems pretty bleak, right? We've talked about like all these terrible things, all these like really intense things that could happen, and then all of these terrible things, all of these problems. But I want to say it's not too late. So going back to what I said at the beginning, the definition of emerging media, by definition, it is still being known and invented and created. So for the first time in history, we have the tools and the connected social cultures to catalyze both hyperlocal and global participation in the imagination of our future. We have now a really solid history of story world building that can articulate our shared imagination with great fidelity. We have those tools now, and getting better and better and quicker and quicker. And empirical science shows that words and images have power to create and mitigate implicit bias or worsen it. So with some of these right strategic actions, we can actually achieve something that has yet to be achieved in those 500 years. And we might be able to contribute to the making of new reality. So I'm just going to speed through these. So I'm really sorry. There's going to be a lot of text on the screen. I hate it when people do that, but I'm that guy now. So the biggest thing is, what bugs in our current social system could we avoid? Thinking about those human beings that could help us avoid those problems with our current social system. And we have to take action now. So the short version is engineer robust inclusion in imagining our future. So easy, I've given you the answer. But obviously that's much more complicated. But the top line interventions are mitigate bias, mitigate groupthink, and design better policy and infrastructure. And many of those examples we've talked as we've gone along, so don't worry that when you see all this information, we've already kind of talked about it in very brief. So we want to really have robust participation from a broad set of not only identities, backgrounds, value systems, fields of knowledge, experience, and in all levels of power, all different roles. yeah, again, many of these we've been through, but promote awareness of bias, make bias blind, construct authentic diversity, use the amplification strategy. We noticed that some of those early pioneers who were women and people of color, like Nani de la Peña, were being left out of the story of virtual reality. So we worked on amplifying that story. She became known as the godmother of VR, which is, you know, complicated in its own way, but it changed the story. It was an important intervention. Lower the barriers to entry, disrupt dependency and rigid bias narratives, allyship, make a business case. We do operate in that profit model. Mitigate groupthink, promote the intrinsic value of each other's sectors, et cetera, et cetera. Public funding is very important, but you know, even public space isn't safe with net neutrality. You know, take a picture. You'll see it on makinganewreality.org. I'm getting the hook. And then design better policy and infrastructure. So design ethical design practices. Break the echo chamber, that kind of filter bubble that we're stuck in. Educate, invest in public, and again, we're seeing that over and again, especially in the United States, we don't have that. Invest in public and non-commercial platforms, et cetera. Collaborative design and world building is, I can't go into, but that's another really important way, like we talked about in the beginning with Minority Report, for imagining what a future could be and then having the capability of manifesting that in a smaller narrative way or in a larger way that actually comes to fruition through imagination, innovation, and manifestation. So thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for Q&A. We do, okay. A short one.
Have we got any questions?
You know everything now, all the solutions.
That was absolutely mind-blowing, Ruthie. I couldn't keep up with it. I could have done with like another hour of that. I really appreciated it. So, are there any questions? Ah, cool.
For the last 30 years, and it's all very good, except every year I meet more. In the last 10 years, I'm meeting more and more one-percenters. Mm-hmm. And even though you deal with social justice and all the great things, the audience is white and middle class and upper middle class. Yep. So this is a problem. My problem is not with the technology. My problem is with Cambridge Analytica, that we don't have democracies. We're living under dictatorships and the suppression of that sort of thing. And technology is not addressing that. Tomorrow's session with Carol Cadwalladr is going to be the best ever because we are not in control of our voting. We didn't vote in Trump. We are and we're not able to unravel that. The meddling in Brexit by Cambridge Analytica and Steve Bannon and Chris Wiley explaining that, and it's been pushed under the carpet. So how can we turn this around, that all this great technology is not being used to make a democratic society? It's great for the one-percenters, and they put on their headsets and they experience things, but it's the clash between the rich and the street people, there's more and more people living on the street now than ever before.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I'm not totally sure how to respond, but I would say one thing, which is that the vast majority of Sundance is a film audience. I don't think that absolves us of any of these things that we've talked about, which is why we continue to talk about it. But I will say that in New Frontier specifically, we have unparalleled parity and diversity between women and people of color. So yeah, film definitely has a real problem with being a big boat that's hard to steer. Thank you.
Hello. Have you guys thought about further about unionization and collectivization?
What was the word?
Unionization. Basically, unionization. So utilizing unions.
Yeah, there's so much information that I wish I could have packed in there, but definitely ways that people are thinking about community design. And actually, this isn't exactly an answer to your question because it's slightly outside of the scope, but community design and actually creating contracts with communities. So the design is actually based on the users of that process or product or et cetera versus, this is one example, versus, so the outcomes of success, in other words, the measurement of success of those outcomes isn't based on the designer's idea of success, but on the success of its users and the community that's using it. But also really interesting, like the Detroit Narrative Agency, the IAPA repository, an Afrofuturist museum. Really interesting ways that people are creating maybe not a traditional union like you're describing, though it is strong in media in Los Angeles in particularly, but ways of creating community to rethink the way that we communicate with one another in this really deep way that's making these kind of interventions. Absolutely, yeah. And also about the need for public space, which is another thing I couldn't really get into, but did kind of like, just touch on very briefly. We got into public space and television way too late. We've got one channel in the United States. It's a little better in the UK for sure, and throughout Europe. But yeah, the need for public space and free and open access, definitely.
This mic up. Great. I'm so sorry, Ruthie.
No,
I'm so sorry,
thank
everybody.
you.
We're going to have to call it there. So I'd just like to say a massive thank you to all the speakers. It's been an incredible day full of real insight and enlightenment. So just a quick round of applause for everybody, please. Thank you.